hear you. And we are also starting to broadcast on Facebook because there are other people who prefer that way of following us. So now I'm passing it to Marissa, and whenever you are ready, Marissa, you can start. Thank you.
Okay. I think should I be letting people in from the waiting room while you're doing the
Sure.
text?
Yes, please.
Okay. Sounds great. So I'm going to set things up and allow Christina to finish doing all the technical work. So are you ready? Okay, great. So I'm going to give you a sense of what I'm going to do for the next half hour to 45 minutes. I'm going to share my screen in a moment and walk you all through a presentation that I prepared. But I expect that it will take me about half an hour to do that, not 45 minutes, because there's such a range of issues that we could discuss. Whatever you all are interested in, I don't know what you're seeing online or, what's brought to you via Instagram or whatever it is. And I'd be very interested to know what issues you're specifically interested in. I'm hoping to provide a framework through which you can think about these issues using a little bit of history. So I am currently a history teacher. So that's part of why that's the approach that I bring to the table. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about me. So as Christina said, I'm Marissa Shapiro. I taught in Peruba 2 years ago now, unbelievable to think about that, and had a wonderful experience with my colleagues, my students. I have a picture here on the top of me on the bike trip with the third-year students at the end of my time there. It was in Austria, wonderful. I survived, exposed to the Czech amazing athleticism, and I lived through it, so that was good for me. I currently teach actually in Manhattan at a school called Hunter College High School. It's a public school. This is a picture of it in the bottom here. It is based on an armory that was in that location. I attended that school when I was a student. In part, taking this job, I was inspired by some of my Czech colleagues who had gone to the school where we worked in Ostrava. And it seemed like a really meaningful thing to go back to your own high school. So that's where I work currently. After I finished living in the Czech Republic, I got my master's degree from Teachers College at Columbia University in teaching high school social studies and history. And before I went to the Czech Republic, I got my bachelor's degree in history from a school called Williams College in the state of Massachusetts. And some of what I'm going to talk about today is informed by my experience living in a different US state, because as I mentioned, I'm from New York City. I went to this high school in New York City. My life experience was being a New Yorker. And what we're going to talk about is that it's a different idea to be from one US state from another. It's a very different identity, and it informs how you view social issues. So I thought I would start with an image you've seen in class many times, my guess, and probably one that you look to and you think, this is the United States, right? It's sort of, you have that in your mind and you're just kind of going from there. And that's how I tend to view it as well, right? You see this space and you think this is a country. But at the same time, this map is telling you something else, which is that there are 50 sort of mini states. And I was talking with Christina before this presentation a little bit about this, is the challenge of translating the word states into Czech, because state is used in most of the world interchangeably with country, with nation. But for the United States, a state means something quite different from the whole country. And so each of these states has the right to make their own laws, to have their own school system with their own policies, to have their own way of collecting taxes. And those impact majorly the sort of social scene of the United States. So one map that I thought really illustrated this is, Christina was reminding me and confirming that I believe there's one income tax rate in the Czech Republic. I'm looking at you, Christine. That's correct, yeah? That if you live anywhere in the country, you pay the same income tax rate. That is not the case if you live in the United States. So if you live in New York, where I live, 8.82% of your money that you make in a year goes to the state of New York, in addition to the taxes that you pay to the federal government. If you live in Nevada, Wyoming, some of these states, Texas, you pay 0 state income taxes. And that's because every state gets to decide their own rules about how much money people should have to pay in taxes. And then they decide how they're going to spend that money accordingly. So that's one example of the kinds of major differences that occur. And people choose to move to a state with 0 income taxes. That's a huge consideration that they make when they're deciding where they live. Now, you can see clearly I did not make that decision by choosing to live in New York State. Those who live in California have a very high state income tax rate. So there's major differences that occur. Another one that you might hear about is the death penalty. So in the United States, if you are tried in federal court, so you can have a trial that is through the federal government, the government of the whole United States, the death penalty is legal. But most crimes that you'd commit in the US, you'd be tried at the state level. Meaning if you commit a crime in New York, you would have to go to court in New York and be under New York state law. The states that are in light blue here do not have a death penalty. So that is not a possible outcome for a crime you commit. The states in dark blue do have a death penalty. And then the stripy states, that means that they still have a legal death penalty, but the governor has decided we're not going to use that law right now. So if you're thinking this is incredibly confusing, why would you allow every state to have a different approach? That is sort of the key to thinking about the variety of this country. So another area where I would say that illustrates even more confusion is gun laws. So this is a map of permitless carry, meaning these are states where if you own a gun, you have to have a license to own a gun, but it's quite easy to get that license in the United States. If you live in one of the states that is green on this map, so allows permitless carry, that means you can carry your gun into a public building. So you could take it to a public college, usually not a school up to the 12th grade, but you could take it into a public college, a park, a state museum, any of those kinds of buildings, and you would be allowed to carry a gun there, okay? The states that are in orange here say, no, you cannot carry a gun into a public building. The yellow states are trying to decide what they're going to do right now. You might, this is quite confusing because you think about that you can travel freely between the different states of the US. There's no border patrol in the sort of sense that we would imagine between countries, but there's very different laws. If you're carrying your gun from one state to another, these kinds of issues come up right away. And so when you hear this term, the United States of America, I want you to start to try to rethink what that means for a second. This is really, sure, it's the United States of America, but really, I think that the states needs to be emphasized much more when we talk about this. And that state identity is really important to people. It's being from New York or Texas, all these different states, Minnesota, New Hampshire, whatever, all 50. Everyone who lives in this country has some connection to their state identity. And I would argue that the united part of this, of what stands for USA, is contested. It's not necessarily something we should assume is the case. And that's because of the history of how this country came to be, something I know that you learn about in school, that I watched my Czech my Czech colleagues teach really in a way that helped me think about it in a new way. And thinking about where the US Constitution comes from. When you're considering why do these differences occur, I think there's 3 areas to think about. One is what year the state became part of the United States? Did it become part of the United States at the very beginning of the United States in the late 1700s? Did it not become a US state until the 1900s? Those are going to be very different stories, how they relate to the federal government. Also, who's part of that state's population matters a lot for this. Is it, what are the most common races of people in that state? What about common religions, countries of origin where people emigrated from, or where their parents or their grandparents came from? Those things will matter in the politics and values and identity of each individual state. And then the last piece is, what is the historical relationship that a state has to being part of the United States? And I'll give you two examples for this. One would be, there were some states, small states, and since the beginning of the United States, that were on the East Coast. So I'll show you a map. Yeah, I have here. Great. I've put some arrows. We'll talk about these two states in a moment. But you might look to, any of these teeny tiny states like Rhode Island and the far East Coast of the United States. When the country was forming, those states were freaked out. They were scared that they were going to lose their independence and power if they agreed they should become part of a country instead of staying independent as their own state with their own identity. Some of these states started as a result of rejecting the policies of a different state. That's the case with the state of Rhode Island. They said there is not enough religious freedom and tolerance in some of the more established states. So we're going to leave and start our new organization, our new way of doing things. Therefore, becoming part of a country like the United States was a scary idea, something that they were not sure they wanted to do. Another example of this I would use is Hawaii, much more modern story. That's a state that the United States occupied once it was already a country, had been a foreign nation with its own queen in the 19th century. And many people to this day do not think that Hawaii should be part of the United States. They consider themselves to be colonized by the United States and do not agree that the US government should be their government. So each state is going to have its own story here. I also want to give you the example of something like Virginia versus Massachusetts. So these are the two oldest states in the sense that they were the first place that the Europeans came to the country and started to settle, at least from the British colony. Spain, we won't talk about today. But Virginia was officially paid for by Queen Elizabeth, sponsored the settlement there. It was supposed to make money, and it was mostly they sent single men who went there to start a colony and to try to figure out how they could get resources and build. Okay, so that's one story around 1600 that starts to take place. Pretty much separate from that, it's not united at all, is Massachusetts, where a group of British people called the Puritans, or you might have heard them as the Pilgrims. If you're learning about our American holiday of Thanksgiving, that's where this story comes from. They sailed there in 1620 to try to make a permanent home. They felt persecuted in England, and they wanted to be able to have a religious freedom. Many women and children were part of this colony, and their focus was on religious freedom and their survival, because there were only 100 of them, and they didn't have sponsorship from the government. So they were trying to figure out how to survive. Those two stories, those separate narratives about this is a settlement invested in building business versus this is a settlement invested in religious freedom and getting away from the British government, have continued meaning today in terms of how those people in those states and those regions of the country think about social issues. I know that might sound ridiculous, but it's really the case. And I think it's important consideration as you start to think about any social issue in the US. Virginia in the last few elections has voted for Democrats, but that's pretty recent. Massachusetts is known for being a state, big supporter of a president like Biden or Obama. These things have historical precedent going all the way back, I think, to when these first places were settled by Europeans. And so, as I was saying, also, people care about their state identity. And these ideas, this history influences the politics of the states right now. The last thing historically that I want to say is that I think you all probably have learned about a bit the Constitution of the United States. And I want to encourage you to think back to the US Constitution when you think about modern social issues, because when the independent states got together to figure out how are we going to work together to make a document we can agree on, one of the major things that they fought about was how much power should the federal government have in comparison to each state. And so the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So what this means is any power or law that's unstated as something that belongs to the federal government is assumed to belong to the states. The states should keep the power as much as possible, unless there's a federal law that's going to specifically say this belongs to the country as a whole, not to individuals. Now, this leads to conflict because states often have a very different idea than the federal government about what they want the law to be. So like in most countries in the world, certainly the Czech Republic, federal law is the supreme law of the land. So it means that US law and decisions overrule any state law. And I want you to think about that because many of the major disagreements you hear about in the US happen when some states and the federal government have different laws for an issue, or they want to have different laws for an issue. I'll give you an example, and this example has still has a lot of relevance right now, is the issue of segregation. So in the United States, after the American Civil War, there was a period called the Jim Crow period, in which in the South of the United States, the area here that's in red, Black and white people, there were laws that kept Black and white people totally separate. As an aside for a second, Christina had mentioned that maybe I should speak to the use of the word Black here. And so this is an issue of language. And our language around how we talk about race in the United States has changed a lot over the last 30 years. Black is considered to be a totally appropriate and acceptable word to say, along with African American. And it tends to be that African American refers to people, although individuals have their own way they want to be identified, tends to be the word that's used to refer to people generally who were descended from people who were enslaved in the United States. And Black tends to be the larger word to describe all people who were part of the African diaspora in the United States. But either way, you can use Black and African American. And we use Black with a uppercase first letter here because it's considered to be an ethnic identity in the same way that we would uppercase Czech or Asian or Russian. So that's sort of the convention that has been established. So what this map shows is before 1954, these are the states in which it was by law required in the United States, the red laws here, the red states here, that Black and white children go to separate schools. And that was state law, not federal. So those states each had laws in place saying there are separate schools for Black and white children. They cannot go to school together. The Supreme Court of the United States decided in 1954 that that was unconstitutional, meaning that went against the US Constitution, and therefore schools could no longer be segregated. You had to have the same schools where Black and white children would go to school together. This is a situation in which the federal government said to all of these states that are marked in red here, you may not have your own state law. You cannot have the law that you have identified for yourself. You have to follow the law that these other states are following, to a certain extent. We're not going to get exactly into that right now, but that you cannot have a law that separates Black and white children. Now, the states did not follow this. They kept keeping their segregated schools in place. And in 1957, the president of the United States sent in the military, federal troops, to go enforce the integration of Black and white schools. And this was considered to be a somewhat symbolic event, but it was a very powerful news event in the United States because it was showing the military going into a US state to enforce a federal law over the wishes of a state law. So you can see here, these are children who were integrating the school, being protected by the military. They are leaving their first day of a school that previously had only white students. And so this is an image that became very known in the United States to represent a moment in which the federal government said, you as a state do not get to make your own decision about this social issue. We are going to have integrated schools. We're not going to have segregation of races. In 1957, I think of that as quite recent. And this issue has a lot of relevance in terms of how many white people in the South continue to think about the federal government in terms of the federal government imposing onto their states and the decisions they had made in their state. And another famous photo that I wanted to show you is you can see people, there was a large mob of white people who were arriving at the school to intimidate the children, the high school children, and try to scare them. And the federal troops were there to actually genuinely enforce that these kids had to go to the school safely. So another much more recent example that I would give of a situation in which the federal government also imposed over the state governments on social issues is the issue of same-sex marriage. So I want you to look at this map for a second. The blue states here, already same-sex marriage was legal before the federal government said anything about it. It's the pink states that have said same-sex marriage is illegal. And in 2015, the Supreme Court of the United States said it is a constitutional right to get married, and the whole country is going to have same-sex marriage. You can start to think about, right, for instance, in this example, one of the reasons that the federal government steps in is, let's say you get married in California, but your husband gets a job in Texas and you're going to move to Texas as a couple. The marriage was not recognized in Texas. So these issues start to become complicated, right? If you have a job working for the federal government, even though your marriage was recognized in the state of California where you lived, let's say, you could not receive the benefits from the federal government until the federal government made a decision about this. So that's how these issues start to come up rather than being able to stay in this sort of in-between, even though oftentimes the US does stay in that in-between in terms of some states get to make one decision, other states get to make another, such as with something like gun laws or the death penalty. So in the case of gay marriage, the Supreme Court decided all the states that are in pink here, you have to perform and acknowledge gay marriages. And those 13 states could no longer have that law, okay? So I give you these two examples because I want you to think about, and we can talk, now we're gonna do questions if anyone has them. When you hear about President Biden or any US president, you know, President Trump, President Obama, anything you were learning about, promoting a policy, doesn't really necessarily matter what it is if you know it's controversial, right? You can assume about half the people in the United States support it and about half do not. In this country, 60% or more supporting a social issue is considered to be a lot, usually. There's a lot of disagreement. The fight generally will be about if the whole country should have to follow a policy. So for instance, with something like if you heard about gay marriage, you know, back in 2015, you guys are kind of young for that mostly. That was about, should those last 13 states have to be part of the policy that the other 37 states have independently decided to have. And so when you think about a social issue, and we're going to talk anything you guys want to ask about, we can do. Is this about state or federal law? Firstly, so is it an issue, a fight within California, for instance, or is it about the whole United States? If it is a state law, what state is it about? And if it's a federal law, which states are most likely to have to change their policy? And that's the framework I would give you. And I can also share this with Christina. So if anybody would want to have these questions later, if they're teachers who wanted to talk about this, these would be my recommendations for when you start to think about a social issue in this country. So that's my overall framework. And I'm happy if anyone wants to ask questions or ask about a specific social issue that they feel like they want some explaining on. I'm happy to do that now. So here we go.
Thank you, Marissa, very much. We've intentionally planned this session so that everyone in the audience has the option to ask questions or raise attention to the issues you want to learn about and you would like to explore with Marissa. So feel free to either use the chat box or unmute yourselves and ask questions directly or comments.
All right, so may I ask you, Marissa, if we can see how United States are actually divided by those issues that you've talked about? What do you think keep the states together? Is it the strong position of the president? Because when you look at Europe, when you look at our teeny tiny country, and the breakup with Slovakia, we shared the history, we had almost the same, economic position, and so on, and we broke up, and we can also see that the European Union doesn't work, as we would like it to work. So what do you think is, is it due to that the states are still, together, and that there are no attempts for some of the states to get independent? We can see Britain, now, well, Scotland, was against leaving EU. There are some attempts to get independence, God knows how it will end up. However, there are those, attempts to do so. So if we see divided United States, how come that they still keep together?
It's a fantastic question. It's really a great question. I think, and I'll propose a couple of different possibilities. I think there's some truth to various parts of this. I think one reason is financial benefit. I think that the federal government provides a lot of financial support. People in every state understand that even if they have their own issues, for instance, with the US military, they have certain benefits that they get. The international relationships of the US being part of NATO. I think a lot of Americans feel comfortable, or at least used to being part of a giant world power. And they know that if they were in an independent state, and I mean that as a state, as if one of the only states by itself, they would not have that, those benefits. I think another part is that people, because it operates as, it is one country, whereas there's certain parts that are like we can sort of use the EU as a metaphor of, you can work freely in different places, these sorts of currency. I think there is a lot of people in the US though, who have family all over the country. And I think that does make it somewhat different in terms, when I think about my aunts and uncles, for instance, some of them live in Ohio, some of them live in Virginia, some of them live in Pennsylvania, California. That is not so uncommon. And so we each have our own state identity, but we also are united by being part of this country. And I think most Americans would feel uncomfortable losing that, even though we talk a lot about how we are annoyed with states we don't agree with. So I think those would be the two pieces, right? The economic and financial stuff, and then the sort of identity piece. And yes, this is a great point in the chat here. And the states are incredibly interdependent on one another. Materials, food, also huge area of interdependence on each other. People, it's very common to go to get your education in a different state. People will live in one state and work in another state. It would be really complicated. I think when it came down to it, most people would say, oh wait, never mind, we should not split up. Yeah. That's a great question. You all are also welcome. I don't know, I think you all can chat me or Christina privately. You're welcome to that too.
Okay, so I have one more question, just came up my mind. Yeah. Well, when you talked about the same-sex marriage, for example, like, do you have also a lot of demonstration, for instance, in the States where the people like do not have the same rights as in the others, or how actually the people achieve their goals, so to say? Because I don't think it's only the decision maybe of the people sitting in the Congress in the end, right? So are you like French people going on strikes and demonstrating all the time? Like, is it this, or is this the vote in the crowd, let's say?
I think it's a little of both, but you're right. That's a huge part of it, is cultural norms will change in the country. And what's being reflected, I think, in terms of a state law, let's use gay marriage as our example. Massachusetts was the first state to have gay marriage only in 2004. That reflected that cultural norms were changing because people had been protesting. They'd been having symbolic weddings, for example. They had been talking about it throughout their state. So you see that it starts at the small local level, but it's happening simultaneously. People do protest. They go to their state legislature. They go to their city hall. So those sorts of local things are certainly happening. But then we debate in this country about, should you try to do something if you want to make change at your state level, or should you try to change it at the federal level? And so, and people disagree. Activists disagree about that. I'd say that people who are sort of on the ground, like protesters, and tend to be focused on their state because it's more achievable, I think, at a small scale. And then lawyers and larger organizations tend to take on the federal piece of it. But you're right that individuals play a huge role in making these changes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We just had the topic in our parliament recently, and it's still illegal here for the same-sex people to get married and have regular marriages, and laws connected to that and rights. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Maybe Vojta?
Yes, I wanted to ask about something I would say is quite sensible, and that would be like the racial problems right now, especially about the Black Lives Matter, the previous year, and Asian hate, I would call it, like this year, as of Mr. Trump spreading the Asian narrative like with COVID. So I wanted to ask if there's some like final solution, because it seems like there has been 400 years of like nothing really changed. I mean, Black people aren't really slaves anymore, but they are still being segregated. And if there's some like, because for us as Europeans, I would say it's really hard to understand this. So if there's some like final solution to this problem, how would people start like not doing this anymore? Because I feel like the damage is not only like the society as itself, but the economy as well.
You articulate a really great question that you're going to be annoyed as an American, where I tell you there's no easy answer to that question. I think the US has its historical context of, as you said, hundreds of years of enslaving Black people as for labor. And then after the fact, when there was an opportunity after the Civil War to try to make radical changes, that those changes were undone after about 10 years. And I'd say most Americans don't know that even, right? Like what you just described. And so I think you all, because you're young, I'm assuming some people here might be teachers, you're probably young too, but for students, you're young. If you're online or you're paying attention to the US, it seems like I think this is being talked about in the mainstream. And that's true, it is. But for most American adults, white adults, that wasn't the case for a lot of their life. That might seem unbelievable to you, but I think it's important to realize that, to sort of like build your context around this. What do I think the solution's going to be? Christina said it's a Nobel Prize question. Yeah. I don't know what the solution's going to be. I see my students talk about these issues with a lot of grace in the US, and they're not as defensive, I think. And that gives me some excitement about the future and what they can think of. But I think, I don't know what the answer is going to be, the solution's going to be. I don't. It's a huge part of living in the US, I'll tell you that. And thinking about politics is thinking about how race fits in. It's the question, are we going to be, what's the identity of this country? Is it going to be a multicultural country, really, where there's many cultures that are considered to be at an equal place? Or is it going to continue sort of as it is right now? I see this question that you have put in the chat too. Do you want to ask out loud? Do you maybe and share a little more light into it? That would be great.
All right. I wanted to ask about the political correctness, because it seems to me as pretty hot topic, but not so like how to put it. Not being it's a being important issue or question in at many circles. It seems to me that something what is not progressive or does not agree with progressive is a lot of times being like oppressed or being shut down, not just like by a lot of people in public, but mostly in people in some charge of some social media or technological giants like Google or Facebook or Twitter. And it seems to me kind of horrific, because one of the most important thing for democracy or individual freedom is freedom of opinion or freedom of speech. Like, I know there are some borders. I can bully someone, but to have a different opinion than the mainstream shouldn't be something like illegal. And it is not like officially, right. But one social media was like being shut down by all the technological giants, and all the progressive was like really happy about that. So I just wanted to ask, what's your opinion about this?
So, not to dodge your question at all, I think it's a really interesting one. But can to provide a little bit more of a framework for, I think, what you're describing, for instance, in the case of something like Facebook, right, or Twitter, is, and you said there are some borders here, right? And you kind of said that's like only part of the question. I think that's like the key issue that we have to resolve in the US about, we have laws that say you can't commit hate speech. If you've heard that term before, have you heard this? This is key to understand. This is the idea you're not allowed to commit hate speech. What does that mean is probably your next question, right? Well, that's the issue that these tech companies are trying to figure out. For instance, they're private companies, so they get to make their own decisions. You only have free speech in a public setting, something that's in sort of the government. Now, where does the internet fit into that? I don't know. That's like, that's, I think, the question you're describing. So you have two questions. There's like the legal piece, and then you're asking me about the cultural, like the vibe, right, as well. So the legal piece, I can't speak to because I think it's not resolved, and that's what they're trying to figure out. And I expect that that will change a lot in the next 5 years in terms of the norms around how is hate speech regulated on the internet, because it's so new. You know, in terms of the cultural vibe and what is the thing around talking about these issues, Yeah, I think you're right to recognize that in the US, we're quite polarized. So there's those who think there's some people who think I should be able to push the line as far as I want. I don't want to be involved in a situation where I'm constantly having to question my words and people are going to villainize me, right? I think that's one side. And then there's also a lot of people who are thinking that in my opinion, this is a new language for me. This country has not been having open conversations around these issues, honestly, until the last 20 years again. And I think some of what you're seeing is the discomfort of finding the line off for those people too. I mean, I see this with my students. You can hear right now the way I'm saying it too. I'm thinking carefully about the words I'm choosing. But that's because of trying to process complicated history is how I like to think about it. But I know I'm not necessarily like answering your question to satisfaction, but I think you're raising a complicated problem. I wish I'd brought a couple of my 16-year-old students with me here because they could talk to you about how they feel about this too. I don't really use social media that much, so I can't speak to like what it's like with cancel culture so much there.
Well, I have like few experience when I like met some Turks on Instagram. They were writing on some post about how Armenian genocide was like a fake, like it didn't happen, and I just wrote them that they are racist or stupid, and it sent me a message that if I will do this one time more, my whole channel would be like removed from the Instagram. They could freely speak about the genocide as fake. That the Armenians make it up, and I didn't quite understand it. Then I think about it, this might be because the algorithm, maybe it's somehow like pick it up the words I make and it didn't with theirs. But I know about the hate speech, and I personally find it that it's not very clever law, to be honest, because it's so vaguely described what it is that it could be very easily misused, and like the people who are like in control of laws are also people. They make mistakes, or they might, when they are in power, to misuse it for controlling the masses, and that's happening a lot. So that's what worries me a lot.
Mm-hmm. And I think,
sorry if I'm taking much of time. I'm sorry.
You don't need to apologize. This is what we're supposed to be talking about, is the complexity of these issues. And I think also you're just describing, okay, now a US company has to make its decision about a sensitive cultural issue that's not even in the US, right? And what are they going to do? Oh, well, we're going to use machine learning. Well, that's not going to work necessarily. So you're right, they make mistakes. I know Tom wants to share a little bit.
Oh yeah, I just like think when something is like more progressive, for example, some changes that are like so fast, maybe for people, or maybe like shown in media, like, or ads, for example, I don't know, specific one that I feel that maybe the people on the other side, for example, like the right or Republicans, for example, I just like feel that makes them a bit more like annoyed or more like extreme defensive, and then it seems like that they are like just like to want to like defend the hate speech, or seems to be a bit more racist. That's my opinion about it. Just sometimes like just some like progressive things to be shown everywhere, talking about it, and just to pushing it so fast. So that maybe that makes some people like very extremely defensive about it for some traditions, I would say.
Yeah, Tom, I'm glad you put it that way. I think that's what I was trying to get at when I was talking about our two sort of polars right now in the US. Those who are being pushed further, as you're describing, feeling like, why is this change happening so fast? And those who are pushing the change, all of whom are making errors because they're humans and trying to figure out those changes.
For example, it is not like very very like dangerous topic or like something to not talk about, but for example, with some with the problems like in California, like with some taxes and homelessness, and people like leaving, for example, to Texas for better tax races,
right?
Then I like heard that some people from the Texas fear that the Californians are gonna change their politics with their thinking of, for example, democratic policies, and they feel like they will, for example, change the Texas to another California with more homelessness, for example. And that I feel, and then I think that makes some people like very defensive in this case, like from Texans.
Excellent. And that's what I hope is the exact kind of analysis you all can do, sort of from this idea of looking at the map where you see 13% tax rate versus 0. You understand these have serious implications for the lives of individuals and the changes in states.
I just think that maybe the people like from the home state, like for example, Texas, just like think that those people that want to like go to their country, like for state, like from California, just wish to like to be integrated to Texas, like to think like Texan. And also like on the other side, if like maybe Texans wish to like move to California, then I think that Californians would like to have integrated Texan to Californian with their thinking, and you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
And then they don't like when something is like changing in their own state, like to be more progressive or more traditionalist.
And one of the ways that the US...
It's about the state identity, as you said.
Right. This will often deal with this kind of, I don't know, disagreement is, well, states sort of have their independence, but you're highlighting already, well, that tension can start to come to the surface as when people start to move, for example. It doesn't even have to be that the federal law would change.
And then it could like seems that there's like the discriminations against Californians because Texans feels that they will change their politics, and on the other side, and it makes like more people angry and not united.
Thank you. Maybe Yvonne?
Hello, Marissa. I also have a question, and I wanted to ask, and first of all, I don't want it to sound offensive in any way, but I wanted to ask if you could really just point out some major differences between like the American education system and the European one, because like in general, Americans, or at least the ones that I have the chance to talk with, are less knowledgeable about the world in general. So if you could really just describe some major differences.
When you say knowledgeable about the world, do you mean history or do you mean geography? Definitely Americans are terrible at geography.
Yeah, I meant like generally also history, but I mean, I can't really remember all the dates and stuff, but like some general history and general geography. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting, maybe this is another part of my answer to your question, Karen, is like, why does the US stay together? Well, most people from the US, they think of their state and then they think of the US and not necessarily the world. Although I would argue that, you know, there are lots of people, you know, because we're such a big country, I can say this, there's millions of people in this country who are very outward looking and want to be part of the world. But I know what you mean. I think our education system, one difference in emphasis that I would say is skills versus content is one part of it. So my Czech students, I was so impressed. They knew many facts, right? They really knew geography. They knew a lot about the timeline of different places in the world. They knew a lot about specific pieces of literature. You know, my students have some of that knowledge too, but the emphasis, I think, in our education system tends to be, can you talk about an event? Can you write about a piece of literature? Can you make an argument using evidence? I think even in math and science, sort of similar. It's about, can you understand how to do experimental procedure? Can you do a proof? Not necessarily about the specifics, but I have to give you the caveat. Remember, I teach at the high school where I went, so I don't have that extensive of an understanding of the full American education system. And the education system in New York is different than in other states for the reasons we've been talking about. Yes, yes. And we have to memorize all the states. It's true. And their capitals. Thank you, Tom.
I mean, like it seems like for Europeans that when they try to learn the 50 states of United States, it's also hard for them. So I think that's why in defense of Americans, I think that's why they seems like to be a bit stupid about geography of the world, you know.
Yeah, it's a lot of mileage within the country, which isn't an excuse, but it's definitely part of the reason. Wonderful question. Thank you.
May I have?
Yeah.
Do you want? Yeah, I'm sorry. Wait, speak.
Oh yeah, Vojta, do you want to go?
No, you can go ahead. I'll wait.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I had a more economical question, if it's okay.
Yeah, of course.
It seems to me that the West world in general, America is just an example, is becoming more and more left wing in several cases. But sorry, that was my youngest sister.
Nope.
For example, the California, which Tom was speaking about, it seems to me like a great example because several democratic states has pushing the taxes really high to make some kind of social system which is lacking in the US in general. But it's several times it just doesn't work out and makes more people just leave the country because the business now is not so profitable. Now it's everything much more complicated. And I don't know. I'm more like capitalist if I have to be honest. But I understand why they are trying to put it why they are trying to put it there. My question is for that if you think that it is like if it is smart like to try to do it, or you think if it is just will bring the state into the debt spiral, which will like in the end crash the economy, because now have America, what I know, the biggest debt in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know if it'll crush the economy, but I liked living in the Czech Republic where everyone had health insurance. I'll tell you that much. And where, here's an example of something that was a cultural shock for me. My school didn't have a school nurse in the school, right? And I asked about that. And they said, well, we can just send any kid to the doctor. Okay. I'm like, wow, how great would it be if I could assume all of my students could have a doctor they knew they could go to outside of the school building. Like that's where we're at. So it's hard for me to answer your question for two reasons. One, I'm not a business person. I'm a public school teacher. So I have a specific outlook on the world, you know, I'll say that. But also I think we're lacking some really basic things. Like it would be great if people could have health insurance when they left their job so they could go take risk and go work at a new place, in my view. Now, you're, I think, talking to the contours of how a specific state should do that. And one of the risks of a state like California going it alone is people move away, right? Because the taxes are too high. So there are Americans who would argue, well, that's why we have to do this as a whole. Hopefully you see from my presentation, that's an ideal. That's not necessarily going to happen right now in the US, right? So that's the debate. Do I think they're headed toward the death spiral? No, not really. I think there's still lots of people want to move there and it's a little overstated. And yeah, people are leaving California, but I think overall the country could afford to push it a little bit more in terms of
not just California, but I know Manhattan also and a few other states.
Yeah, Manhattan is definitely, I mean, we're about to have a mayoral election. So just for who's going to run New York City. And we're debating this too. Should the city be trying to attract new businesses with tax breaks? Or should they just assume New York City's awesome, people are going to come here and we need to be investing in social programs? Or do we need to find a balance? I mean, that's the obvious answer. But where that line should be, we don't agree necessarily. Yeah. But where do I think personally? I don't know. I teach high school history, so I'm going to stay in my lane.
I think
next. 1 second, Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about politics, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this question is like two parts, but the main part would probably be about like foreign policy of the United States as of right now. As we could have seen, it's also connected like with my previous question that like the society is so divided that I don't really believe that United States can really rule the world or protect the world from China and Russia as of right now, as the society is so divided on many issues. So I just wanted to ask, because I don't really know many Americans, like what is their perception, if they want to like focus more on their state, or if they want to still be that like country as of the previous century that saved Europe twice from falling to a regime that hasn't really been nice to some people, or if they rather would like to focus on like the domestic policy. And the second part of this question would be just shortly, how do they perceive people like AOC? Because they're really different from the current politics or the previous politicians.
You can see my colleague behind me. I'm actually in my office at work. It's a great question. I think, okay, wait, the first part was about the US and the world, right? And the second part's about AOC, right? And we'll talk about who that is in a moment. Wait, can I ask you, do you know AOC like from the internet? How is she? Is she just really a celebrity?
I don't really know how I managed to like get to know her, but I know that I'm trying to follow politics, and at least recently, she's like a big figure at the news that I'm listening to. But previously, she was really loud when US was talking about like Green New Deal and stuff like that. So like the progressive part of the politics.
Yes. Okay. So 2 questions. That's both great. One is the foreign policy of the US. I don't have my finger to the pulse of this whole country because I live in one very specific state. So I would be great if we had some other Fulbrighters from other parts of the United States to talk to this. I think most Americans are not at all focused on the US's role in the world right now. I think people were very, very worried about the Trump-Biden election, not because of the US's place in the world, but because of our own domestic issues. I think the US has been incredibly inwardly focused since 2016 when President Trump was elected, and that has continued. At the same time, I think many Americans sort of take for granted or accept the US's role in the world and don't realize, the US has a presence that has remained since World War II, and sort of accepts it that way. I want to pause what I'm saying because I know it's 10. I can stay for a few minutes, but I also don't want to force people to be here. So I'm going to keep answering this question, but if you have to go, I completely understand. This is your afternoon, probably a really nice day there, I hope. So the other part of that question, so my answer to that is, yeah, you're right. Americans are not thinking about the foreign policy, but there is an assumption, I think, that for many Americans that they want to maintain their role in the world. And you rightly point out those 2 ideas are in tension, and we'll see what happens. The second question is about, Vojta used AOC to describe, she's a congresswoman named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I'm really impressed you knew about her. She is a congresswoman she represents Queens and Brooklyn, so very near to where I live. She has developed a lot of celebrity because she will talk to people on her Instagram story, which is quite unusual for a congresswoman. So she's really educated in how to communicate with her constituents and with the country. But she does not represent the mainstream of the Democratic Party for the most part, but rather she tends to be popular with people who are progressives, right? Who are going to be voting for this party consistently, who may have supported Bernie Sanders for president, for instance. And there's a fight within the party about should someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her policies be what the party leads with, or should they be trying to convince people who are more in the middle to support them? So, but yeah, but she represents that divide in that question.
Thanks.
Of course. Lucy, you have your hand up.
Hello. When talking about social media, I would like to ask you how Americans perceive blocking Trump on Twitter. Like, if corporations have the right to mute the president, or like, is it acceptable?
So that's right. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lucy. Did you just say thanks, or is that it?
Yeah. I'll just say thank you.
Okay, I didn't want to cut you off. Zoom is so awkward. Here, let me put my headphones in for some sound. Uh-oh. Okay, one second. Do you need help? No, okay. Good, but you don't have to worry about it. Okay. So sorry. All right. Anyway, so the issue around banning Trump. Okay. You all can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So those are private companies, so they get to make their own decision, as you said, private corporations. In terms of how Americans feel about it, I don't know. I think it's sort of like what Tom was talking about earlier. People have one very strong opinion or another. I don't think most Americans some are looking at it with nuance and talking about this is a free speech question. What does this mean for our democracy? I think most people, though, were either really sick of Trump or really loved him and wanted to keep hearing from him. So that informs their view more than the nuances of democracy, because it became incredibly emotional to deal with him for both sides, right? Either people who loved hearing what he had to say or people who could not bear to hear his voice anymore. So, yeah.
So perhaps any last question?
You all were so fantastic. It was so fun to talk with you all. Tom, did you want to share one more? You see, look, your pen is up.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add to the topic of California that some the social changes are great. I don't say that they are wrong about it. I'm more if I talk about politics more towards a bit right, but I just think that that's the California is great example if you make something progressive so fast. I mean for example, if this is current situation of some state, and let's say, okay, there's some problem, I can change it. There's a tiny spot I can add something that could make something better. But if I just push it so fast, then I would say that for example that it won't work out great. For example, with our country, when our country was made from the Austria-Hungary, from the monarchy, and it suddenly changed to republic, then for a few years there were also some problems, maybe weaker economy or some changes laws and exploitable things,
I think when you're speaking to Tom, also we can think about that the US, one of the problems that this country will face, though, is you're talking about within California. Yeah, this issue, how quickly do you make change? It's going to come up, but you're probably always, if you want to make a social change at the federal level in the United States, it's probably going to be too fast for at least 10 or 20 of your states. And so at what point, what's the point at which the country should decide to make a change that's going to be too fast? Because it's always going to be, I think, because we have such variety, too fast for some. Maybe Nicole?
Hi. My question, it's actually not about politics, but I wanted to ask, it's about USA scholarship, because I tried it, I didn't make it, but I will try next year. And it's about, when you go to USA as an exchange student, can I actually graduate here? Or what are the conditions for graduating here? And then if I can go to college?
I think Christina could probably speak to that more, right? Yeah.
Nicole, that's an excellent question. And I would certainly also refer you to the previous live lesson we have on our YouTube channel with contact information for our student advisor who will help you with the admission process. But a general response is that yes, you can, of course, graduate in the Czech Republic, and then the results will be interesting for the US university or program that you are interested in. So lots of information on our website, and get in touch with our Education USA advisor, who her name is Marielle. She's an American. She works as a colleague in our office, and she will be happy to help you to orient yourself in the selection of US programs.
Thank you.
And she will happily guide you through the admission process.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I was asking about graduating in USA. You know, if I go there for 1 year, for exchange year, if I can graduate in USA, not in Czech Republic.
Well,
I know it
based
depends
on the
on
information I have, and maybe some of the teachers would be better to respond to your question, but I think on some occasions you may need to pass an exam that acknowledges some classes or grades you received in the US or you completed in the US. But in terms of graduation, as the graduation process in the Czech Republic and in the US is very different and also happens at a different time, I don't think that it would be easy to do. So also every school can have different requirements. The question is why you need your graduation. If you need your graduation to apply for university, does the university accept your graduation from a US university, from a US high school, or does your university require that you graduate at a Czech high school? You know, those are the questions for our student advisor.
Yeah, I get it. Thank you so much.
No problem.
So I can stay a little longer. I don't mind if you want to ask another question, but I also want to be cognizant, Christina, of your time. So what would be good?
We can take the final Samuel's question. He's been very patient.
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I don't want to take much any more of your time, so I try to be fast. What was about the progressivism about that Tom was speaking? I want to a little bit react to that. I think that the problem, why so many people have problem with it, is not only that it is trying to be put into practice fast, but I think that in several examples, it is contradictory what is trying to achieve, sometimes even hypocritical. For example, they are saying that they are fighting against racism and stuff like that, but several of their quotes and stuff is so racist when you think about that. For example, that black people cannot be racist. Like, how is racism somehow connected to special race? Isn't that in the nature of itself pretty racist? And I have problem with progressivism a lot, because the more I know about it, the more I'm confused by it. I don't really know what they are trying to achieve. I don't really know what's their point. And in several schools, they fire up several teachers because the school wasn't enough culturally and etymologically diverse. They origin, or the color of their skin was the reason why they were fired, not because they were lacking some education or skill. And the quotes like that, or the quotes that mean that there's need to be 50 to 50 people in some work. Like, how can we like decide from your gender what work you will do? Isn't like your freedom like to choose the job you want to do? It just seems to me so against what it's trying to achieve, the equality, and doing everything against it, a freedom or something like that, and doing something so tyrannical. I don't just think that the problem is that it's just they trying to put it so fast. If the things they would do would at least make sense, but to me at least, I may be weird, don't make in many cases any sense at all.
So I think, and I can chat you my email, because I would love for you to send me the specific examples you're looking at so I can help you parse through, like, what state is this happening in? What town? What's going on? Because that would be my encouragement to you, is to look at the specific instances, and we can think about what is going on in that context around the relationship between that local place, because it's, and I think what you're thinking about, or one thing you're looking at, is we have a national movement in the US, but we have all these separate little places that have their own histories. And how can we kind of find that, that balance? So I'm going to message you my email, because it's hard for me to address your question without understanding the specific stuff you were reading. And then you're welcome to, we can continue this conversation there, because I'd be very interested in doing so.
Well, thank you, Marissa, very much.
Absolutely. Yeah,
and thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your amazing questions. We had about 60 people here in Zoom, and up to 20 more followers on Facebook. So amazing crowd. I'm really glad that you brought and opened many additional topics. And I really admire how brave Marissa was to open the floor to all of you for 30 minutes, because she was answering questions really across the board. Education, politics, history, everything. So thank you very much, Marissa. We really appreciate your time, and we wish you a pleasant day in the US. And for everyone else, please complete the feedback form we shared in the chat box, so that we know how we can make the future lessons even better. And in terms of this school year, there will be one more live lesson on June the 7th, and the theme will be also on demand. It will be art, specifically American cinema, American movies, American filmmakers, and American genres. So stay tuned, watch our Facebook updates, follow our website updates, and we look forward to seeing you at another Fulbright event. Thank you very much, and huge thank you to Marissa.
Thank you very much. It was so great to be with you all.